A 9-year-old girl's innocent question brought a packed Ohio community center to a hushed standstill, prompting Donald Trump to unravel a raw, personal tale of faith tested and reclaimed, a moment so poignant it left the room awash in tears. The Mansfield Community Center was alive with a restless hum that cold February evening in 2025, a far cry from its usual rhythm of bingo nights or potluck suppers. The folding tables, typically laden with casseroles or raffle tickets, stood bare tonight, pushed against the walls to make room for rows of mismatched chairs. Under the flickering fluorescent lights, the scuffed linoleum floor gleamed faintly, reflecting the faces of a crowd that defied easy categorization. Grizzled farmers in faded denim, factory workers with grease-stained hands, retirees clutching styrofoam cups of watery coffee, and families with kids too young to care about politics but old enough to sense the buzz. At the front of the room, behind a weathered wooden podium, stood Donald Trump, his presence as commanding as ever, golden hair swept back, hands slicing the air in that familiar staccato. Yet tonight, beneath the bravado, there was a stillness, a quiet weight that seemed to tug at the edges of his usual bombast. I'd been dispatched by the Mansfield Gazette to cover the event, a small-town assignment I figured would yield little more than a perfunctory write-up for our dwindling subscribers. Leaning against the back wall, notebook in hand, I braced myself for the predictable. Policy pledges, boasts about past triumphs, maybe a barbed quip at his critics' expense. The crowd listened as Trump launched into his spiel, jobs coming back to the heartland, the economy surging under his watch, making America great again. His voice boomed through the crackling microphone, brimming with that trademark confidence, but the words felt worn, like a vinyl record scratched from too many plays. The applause came in polite bursts, more habit than fervor, and I scratched out a few rote lines, my pen dragging across the page. My mind was already drifting to a bland headline. Trump rallies Mansfield with familiar promises. Then I saw her, a small figure perched 3 rows from the front, dwarfed by the sea of adults around her. She couldn't have been more than 9, her dark curls pulled back with a faded blue ribbon that fluttered slightly as she shifted in her seat. Her lavender Sunday dress stood out like a soft flame against the room's drab palette of grays and browns, a quiet defiance of the winter gloom outside. In her lap, she cradled an old Bible, its black leather cover cracked and peeling at the edges, the gold lettering on its spine long since faded. It wasn't just a book, it was a relic, a piece of someone's past, held tight as if it might slip away. Beside her sat a woman I assumed was her mother, her face etched with a mix of pride and faint anxiety, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The girl's fingers gripped the Bible with a ferocity that belied her size, knuckles whitening as if it were her anchor in a storm. Her name, I'd discover later, was Emily. She didn't fidget or whisper to her mother like most kids might in a room this restless. Instead, she sat with a stillness that unnerved me, a quiet intensity that drew my gaze even as Trump's voice rolled on. What was she doing here, I wondered, amid this patchwork of grown-ups debating factory closures and tax rates? Had her mother hauled her along to fill a seat, or had she begged to come, driven by some purpose I couldn't yet fathom? Either way, she didn't blend in. Not with her small frame or her solemn air, and certainly not with that Bible, which seemed to carry a weight far beyond its pages. The night wore on, as predictable as the snow piling up outside. Trump fielded questions from the floor, a farmer in a John Deere cap grumbling about soybean prices, a retiree with a trembling voice asking about Medicare cuts, a young man in a red MAGA hat offering a gushing compliment about leadership. The line at the microphone shrank, and I glanced at my watch, mentally polishing a lid that had barely made it past the editor's desk. Former President Trump addresses local issues in Mansfield stop. Then Emily stood. It was a subtle motion at first, easily missed amid the rustling crowd. Her mother leaned down, whispering something close to her ear, and Emily nodded, her jaw tightening with a resolve that seemed too big for her frame. She rose from her chair, clutching that Bible like a knight might wield a shield, and made her way toward the microphone stand. The room didn't register her immediately. Murmured conversations droned on, chairs scraped against the floor, a cough rasped from the back corner. But as she slipped into the line, a hush began to spread, slow and uneven, like ink bleeding through paper. Heads turned. Eyes squinted, then widened. Whispers darted through the crowd. Who's that kid? What's she doing? Trump noticed her too, halting mid-sentence as she approached. He tilted his head, a faint smile curling his lips, the kind that softened his edges just enough to catch you off guard. Well, look at this, he said, his voice lighter than it had been all night. We've got a young one stepping up. What's your question, sweetheart? Emily shifted the Bible in her arms, her small fingers trembling but resolute as she stepped to the mic. Her head barely cleared the stand, and she stretched up slightly, balancing on her toes. The room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the faint tick of my watch, the distant hum of the heater kicking on. I stopped writing, my pen frozen mid-stroke, my breath catching somewhere in my chest. Her voice, when it came, was soft but piercing, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Mr. Trump," she said, pausing to swallow hard. "What does God mean to you?" The question landed like a thunderbolt in a quiet meadow, its echoes rippling through the room. The air grew heavy, thick with the weight of it, pressing down on every shoulder, every heart. Faces froze, some in stunned disbelief, others in awkward discomfort, a few in reverent awe. Trump blinked, his hands stilled mid-gesture, and for a long moment, he didn't speak. This wasn't a query about trade deficits or election recounts. It wasn't something he could sidestep with a quick barb or a rehearsed line. It was raw, unguarded, and impossibly vast, delivered by a child who couldn't have known the gravity she'd unleashed, or maybe she did, in that pure, unfiltered way kids sometimes do. I darted my eyes around, cataloging the reactions. A burly man in a flannel jacket shifted uneasily, his boots scuffing the floor. A woman with silver hair pressed a hand to her chest, her lips parting slightly. Emily's mother stared at her daughter with wide, unblinking eyes, as if she hadn't expected the question to actually leave her lips. And Trump. He stood there, peering down at this tiny girl with her tattered Bible, and something in his face cracked open. The brashness faded, replaced by a flicker of something softer, almost vulnerable, a shadow of the man beneath the persona. "That's a hell of a question," he said finally, his voice dropping low, almost reverent. He leaned against the podium, one hand braced on its edge, the other brushing through the air as if searching for the right words. "Not many people ask me that. Not many people dare to." The crowd held its breath, suspended in the pause. I scribbled the line down, my heart thudding harder than it should have. Emily didn't flinch, her eyes locked on him, waiting. She wasn't here for platitudes or a pat on the head, she wanted an answer, and somehow, Trump seemed to sense the depth of her need. "When I was your age," he began, his tone shifting into something more intimate. "I used to sit in church with my family every Sunday. Big, beautiful church in Queens, First Presbyterian. My mother made sure we were there, all polished up, sitting in those hard wooden pews. I'd stare at the stained glass windows, the reds, the blues, the golds, and wonder what it all meant. Was God up there, looking down? Was he listening to a kid like me? I didn't know." He paused, his gaze drifting over the crowd before settling back on Emily. "My father, he was a tough guy, real tough. Built everything from the ground up. He'd tell me faith was like building a business. You start with nothing, just an idea, a spark, and you keep working at it, even when it feels like the whole thing's about to collapse. I didn't get it back then. Thought it was just something he said to keep me quiet, to make me sit still." A faint chuckle rippled through the room, loosening the tension for a fleeting second. A few heads nodded, a couple of smiles broke through the solemnity. But Emily didn't laugh. Her expression stayed grave, her small hands tightening around the Bible again, her fingers tracing its worn edges. Trump noticed, and his voice softened further, shedding its usual polish. "But life, it's not that simple," he went on. "You grow up, you face things. Losses. Failures. Moments when you're down so low you don't know if you'll ever climb back up. I've had those, plenty of them. And I'll be honest with you, there were times I didn't feel God anywhere near me. Times I thought, if he's real, why's this happening? Why isn't he fixing it? What's the point?" The room turned into a vacuum, every sound swallowed by the weight of his words. This wasn't the Trump they'd come to see, no swaggering tycoon, no unrelenting showman. This was a man peeling back layers most of us didn't know he had, exposing something raw and unscripted. I wrote faster, my pen carving deep into the paper, trying to capture the shift in his tone, the unexpected gravity pulling at his voice. "There was one time," he said, his voice dropping even lower, barely above a whisper, "when I lost someone close to me. My brother, Fred. Best guy you'd ever meet. Funny, kind, had this light about him that drew people in. You couldn't help but like him. But he had his struggles, real bad ones. Alcohol, it got its hooks in him, and no matter how much we tried, my family, me, it wasn't enough. When he died, I was angry. Angry at him for leaving too soon, angry at myself for not doing more, angry at God for letting it happen." He stopped, his hand gripping the podium harder, knuckles whitening against the wood. The crowd didn't move, didn't dare breathe. Emily's eyes glistened under the harsh lights, but she didn't look away. I could see her mother shift closer, a hand hovering near her daughter's shoulder, poised to comfort her if the moment broke her. Around the room, Faces softened, some with empathy, others with a flicker of recognition, as if Trump's words had brushed against their own buried wounds. For a long time after that, Trump continued, his voice rougher now, I didn't want anything to do with faith. I turned my back on it. Thought, what's the use? If God's there, why'd he take Fred? Why'd he leave me here to deal with it? I threw myself into work, into winning, thinking that'd fill the hole. But it didn't. It never does. He exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping just enough to notice. But then, something changed. I don't know if it was a dream or just my mind playing tricks, but one night, years later, I saw Fred again. Clear as day in my head. He was smiling, that big goofy grin he used to have, the one that made you feel like everything was gonna be okay. And he said, don't give up, Don. You've got more to do. I woke up, or maybe I didn't, and I just sat there, staring into the dark, feeling something I hadn't in years. His voice cracked, just for a heartbeat, and he cleared his throat, steadying himself. That's when I realized, faith isn't about having it all figured out. It's not about knowing why things happen the way they do. It's about trusting there's something bigger, even when you're lost in the dark. It's about climbing that ladder my dad talked about, one shaky step at a time, even when you're scared it'll break under you. Emily's grip on the Bible loosened slightly, her small shoulders easing as if his words had lifted some unseen burden. A single tear slipped down her cheek, catching the light like a prism, and the crowd noticed. Whispers stirred, soft, awed murmurs, but no one interrupted. Trump stepped away from the podium, closer to the edge of the stage, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that stripped away the room's edges. So, to answer your question, he said, his voice firming up, steady now. God to me, he's the reason I keep going. He's the hope when everything else falls apart. He's the one telling me, telling all of us, that we're not done yet, no matter how many times we fall. He's the push to climb that ladder, even when it feels like the rungs are cracking. The room exhaled, a collective release of tension that seemed to ripple through the chairs. Emily wiped her cheek with the sleeve of her dress, and her mother pulled her close, whispering something I couldn't hear over the faint rustle of the crowd. Trump straightened, his gaze sweeping the room again, taking in the faces staring back at him. This little girl, he said, gesturing toward her with an open hand. Just asked something most of us are too afraid to even think about. What does God mean to us? It's not a small thing, it's everything. It's the question that cuts through all the noise, all the politics, all the stuff we hide behind. Applause started, tentative at first, then swelling into a wave. People rose from their seats, clapping not just for him, but for Emily, for the moment that had unfolded like a flower opening in the dead of winter. I scribbled furiously, my notes a chaotic sprawl of half-formed thoughts and jagged quotes, my hand cramping from the effort. This wasn't the story I'd expected to file, not by a long shot. What's your name? Trump asked, his voice cutting through the fading applause as he leaned forward slightly. Emily, she said, her voice barely audible, a fragile thread over the room's hum. Emily, he repeated, nodding as if committing it to memory. That's a beautiful name. You're braver than most people in this room, you know that. Takes guts to ask a question like that. She nodded, a faint smile breaking through her tears, tentative but real. My grandpa, he gave me this Bible, she said, her voice trembling but clear. He said God's always there, even when you can't feel him. Even when it's hard. Trump's expression softened further, a rare vulnerability flickering across his face, unguarded and fleeting. Your grandpa was a smart man, he said, his tone almost paternal. He was right. And you reminded me of that tonight, Emily. You reminded all of us. The crowd settled back into their seats, but the energy had shifted irrevocably. What had begun as a rote town hall, a pit stop on some political circuit, had transformed into something else, a shared confession, a fragile bridge of grace spanning a room full of strangers. A man near the back stood, his voice rough but deliberate, cutting through the lingering hum. He was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, his hands calloused from years of work, maybe a mechanic or a lineman, the kind of guy you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Mr. Trump, he said, pausing to steady his words. I've been wrestling with my faith for years. Lost my job a while back, then my wife got sick. Hearing you talk like this, about anger, about doubt, about still going on, it's the first time I've felt like it's okay to not have it all together. Do you think that's part of it? That we're all just too scared to admit we're struggling? Trump leaned on the podium again, his gaze locking with the man's across the room. You know, he began, his voice measured. I think you're onto something. A lot of us. We're afraid to admit we're not as strong as we want people to think. We put on the face, the tough act, but faith? Faith isn't easy. It's messy, it's complicated, and sometimes it feels like you're shouting into the wind and getting nothing back. But that's what makes it powerful. It's not about being perfect, it's about trying, even when you don't have the answers, even when you're mad as hell. The man nodded, his expression softening as he sank back into his chair, a murmur of agreement rippling through those around him. A woman a few rows over stood next, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun, her voice trembling with the weight of unshed tears. "I lost my son 2 years ago," she said, clutching the edge of her seat for support. "Car accident. I've been so angry at God ever since, I feel like I've lost my faith completely. Do you think it's too late to find it again?" Trump stepped closer to the stage's edge, his voice dropping to a gentle but firm cadence. "Listen," he said, meeting her eyes. "It's never too late. Faith isn't something you lose forever. It's not like a wallet you misplace and that's it. It waits for you. Sometimes it's in the quiet, when you're not even looking, that it creeps back in. You don't have to have it all figured out, just take a step. One step." The woman nodded, tears spilling over as she sat down, her hands trembling in her lap. Around the room, others shifted, some dabbed at their eyes with sleeves or tissues, others sat in reflective silence, their faces etched with their own unspoken stories. The air crackled now, not with noise but with a palpable thread of connection, weaving through the crowd like a current. Emily sat back down, her Bible resting in her lap, her mother's arm draped protectively around her shoulders. Trump straightened, his gaze sweeping the room one last time, taking in the sea of faces. Some weary, some hopeful, all touched. "We're all climbing that ladder," he said, his voice steady but softer than it had been all night. "Different steps, different struggles, different falls. But faith. It's what keeps us moving. It's what ties us together, even when the world out there." He gestured vaguely toward the windows, the dark Ohio night beyond. "Tries to rip us apart. Politics, opinions, all that noise, it fades. But this sticks. So ask yourselves what faith means to you. Don't be afraid of the answer, no matter how messy it gets, because faith isn't about knowing everything, it's about believing anyway." The applause came again, slow at first, then building into a tide, punctuated with sniffles and the scrape of chairs as people stood. Hands reached out, strangers clasped shoulders, nodded to one another, shared quiet words. I closed my notebook, my pages a jumbled mess of ink and awe, knowing I'd have to start from scratch. This wasn't just a story about Trump, it was about Emily, about the man in the back, the woman with the silver bun, about all of us grappling with questions too big to hold. As Trump stepped off the stage, he paused by Emily, crouching down to her level, his suit jacket brushing the floor. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice low but sincere, "just for her. You've got more courage than most folks twice your age. Don't ever lose that." She smiled, small but sure, her tears dried now. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady at last. "For answering." He stood, gave her a faint nod, then turned to wave at the crowd one last time before slipping out the side door. But the room didn't empty, not yet. People lingered, clustering in small knots, their voices soft but animated. A farmer clapped the mechanic on the back, sharing a laugh that broke the tension. The silver-haired woman hugged a neighbor, tears still glistening on her cheeks. I packed up my things, overhearing snippets of conversation, stories of loss, flickers of hope, questions about faith that hadn't surfaced in years. As I slung my bag over my shoulder, I caught Emily's voice, soft but clear, as she leaned into her mother. "Grandpa would have liked this, wouldn't he?" Her mother smiled, tears welling in her eyes, her hand smoothing Emily's curls. "He'd have loved it, sweetheart. He'd have been so proud of you." The crowd thinned, drifting out into the biting night, their breath fogging in the air as they headed to their trucks and sedans. I lingered a moment longer, watching Emily and her mother gather their coats, the Bible still tucked under the girl's arm like a talisman. The room felt different now, emptier, yes, but lighter too, as if some collective weight had lifted, carried away by a question and the answers it drew out. Back at my desk later that night, I tore up my draft and started over, the keys clacking under my fingers as I tried to do justice to what I'd witnessed. Emily's question hadn't just silenced a room, it had cracked open a door, letting light spill into places long shadowed. And as I wrote, I realized something. Sometimes, the smallest voices carry the deepest truths, and in their echoes, we find pieces of ourselves we didn't know were missing. The story of Emily's question and Trump's response reveals profound lessons that resonate deeply as we navigate the later chapters of life. At its heart, it teaches us that faith is not a flawless certainty but a fragile, persistent climb. A ladder we ascend despite shaky rungs, as Trump described. For those of us who've weathered loss, like Fred's passing or the silver-haired woman's son, it's a reminder that anger and doubt are natural companions to grief. Yet faith waits patiently for our return, never truly lost. Emily's courage, a child daring to ask what adults fear, shows that vulnerability can bridge divides, even in a fractured world, offering seniors a call to share hard-earned wisdom without pretense. The tale underscores that life's meaning often lies in quiet moments of connection, not grand victories, urging us to cherish small acts of listening or questioning as they ripple outward. In our twilight years, we can apply this by embracing uncertainty, trusting in a purpose beyond our understanding, and fostering bonds with those beside us on the climb, knowing that, like Emily's Bible, our legacies endure through the truths we pass on.